Look, the gentleman who's going to be speaking next doesn't really need an introduction. Also, he didn't really give us an introduction. It literally just has like 4 words. But what we're going to go with is this gentleman is the managing director at InfoSect. He's also one of the, he's the other organizer, sorry, of B-sides and C-sides. And he's also a living meme, as you've probably seen for the whole day. Silvio, go for it, Silvio.
I'll just share my screen and we'll kick it off. Is that all good?
It's still loading. So we can see the
next slide.
Yeah, so you'll want to change the
oh, this happened earlier.
So display settings. If you click on display settings, I believe there's a option there.
I will be 1 second while I fix this. Computers,
can solve complex algorithms, can't use PowerPoint.
And find bugs in code in 5 seconds.
Yeah. PowerPoint though? Let's maybe we should, I know Silvio does some like twitching, right? Maybe we should get him in front of Excel. We'll do like an Excel off between him and Alan.
That would be interesting.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
I'm almost there. This is
That's all right, mate. We're all getting used to this new medium.
I had it all set up, and now I've stuffed it up. But that's okay. Here we go. Here we go. It's coming.
That's what she said.
Wow.
Speaker notes again. Swap, yeah. Go swap.
Is that good?
No.
Swap present.
Now it's good.
Great. Okay. So sorry about that. Hopefully this that makes up for all my lacking of dad jokes for the rest of the talk. So this talk is about things to do with a Faraday cage, which is a thing that I bought some months ago. So what is a Faraday cage? Basically, it's an RF shielded box or a cage. So it blocks RF. That's pretty much it. And how does it block RF? So the basic strategy is that a metal sheet blocks RF. And instead of a metal sheet, you can use some sort of mesh or some sort of conductive mesh with the appropriate mesh size to the wavelength that or the frequency that you're blocking. Incidental Faraday cages that you might not want. If you're in an elevator or a lift and your mobile phone loses reception, well, it's acting like a Faraday cage. If you're in a metal shed at the back of your house and you don't have mobile reception, that metal box around it, that's a Faraday cage. If you're super cheap, you can sort of simulate a Faraday cage with things like an Aldi freezer bag is a good example where it has a foil lined, a foil lining, and that can block RF. If you have a chip packet, for example, sometimes they're foil lined as well. And in fact, I've heard, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard this, that in the UK some years ago, people were trying to steal, teenagers or someone was trying to steal, I don't know, things out of stores, games, computer games and whatnot, and putting them into chip packets so that it wouldn't trigger the RFID scanning as they pass through those gates as you leave the store. You can also get commercial Faraday bags. So if you're, for example, in law enforcement and you've seized a mobile device or some other personal computing device and you don't want it to communicate to the outside, maybe you're, the person, the criminal or whatever is trying to communicate to it and delete all the files, you can put them in these Faraday bags as well, almost like evidence bags. And sometimes you see them in movies as well. Got a picture of enemy of the state, on the right, which is a sort of a crazy guy that's, thinks the state is following him and ends up that actually happens. But the mesh is actually probably too big to work effectively in the movie, but at least we can see through the mesh and, see what's, that crazy setup that he's got behind him. So we need a Faraday cage because transmitting in most interesting RF bands is illegal. And if you want to run your own mobile base station, you really don't want the attention of ACMA, with the Australian Communications Media Authority, or the telcos. And I've been told that they are very aggressive in looking at people that run base stations illegally. And if you're trying to do vulnerability research as well on mobile devices or RF devices, you don't want to crash random devices outside of the ones that you're testing. So I'm not going to go have too much more PowerPoint bullet slides. I'm going to go into pictures very shortly, but this is sort of one of my last slides about the setup. I've got a Ramsey box here, pictured on the right. This is a pretty standard sort of box for RF testing in sort of the commercial space. It's an expensive device. It's about $8,000 Australian, including delivery. It comes from the US, and it has a number of possible configurations that you can use. In my setup, I've got 4 SMA pass-through, which is sort of like an antenna connector, 4 SMA pass-throughs. I've got USB 3.1 pass-through. I've got gigabit power over Ethernet pass-through. I've got power. I've got an internal light and fan. I've got a viewing window, and I can even use gloves to handle mobile devices inside that Faraday box as well. And when I say pass-through, it basically means that I can connect, for example, a USB device from outside the box, passes through inside the box, and I can connect my mobile phone to a USB cable. So I'm going to talk about 2 attacks that sort of I've been playing with using this Ramsey box. I'm using this Faraday cage. I'm going to look at Wi-Fi, which is sort of how to set up some sort of environment. And I'm going to look at baseband attacks as well, and fuzzing mobile handsets using sort of a malicious 4G base station. And that is a terrible picture of someone soldering. I would not recommend doing this at home if you have a soldering iron. So attacking Wi-Fi, you can act as a malicious radio. So this is sort of the attack. You're some sort of device. It's sort of sending out malicious Wi-Fi signals, but not really just sort of in the application layer. We're looking at the communications layer, and you're attacking the Wi-Fi chipset firmware in your laptop, mobile, and router, and so forth. There has been some work in the past about attacking Wi-Fi radios. In one particular attack, Broadcom floor, sort of Broadphone or something like that, how they pronounced it, basically attacking the Wi-Fi chipset in 1 billion smartphone devices and attacking the firmware in the chip that handles the Wi-Fi communication. So not attacking the kernel, not attacking the sort of the application or user land sort of space, but you're actually attacking the firmware running on the chipset that handles the Wi-Fi communication that talks to your kernel and your operating system. So if I want to start playing with Wi-Fi, firmware radio attacks, this is a setup that I've done with my Ramsey box. I've got 2 Wi-Fi adapters. I've connected them together. Instead of connecting them via an antenna, I've just connected them via a cable. I've also attached an attenuator, which basically degrades the signal or lowers the power of the signal. And this is a 30 dB attenuator, which according to my sort of, the mathematics of path loss over free space, this simulates about a gap of about 15 centimeters from the transmitting device to what eventually gets the signal, not including the loss in the cable and the connectors as well. So I've connected 2 Wi-Fi adapters. One's transmitting, one's receiving. So one's acting as an access point. The other one's going to be listening for that access point and try to connect to it. I've also got a couple of antennas above. I was also playing with using an SDR to transmit Wi-Fi signals as well, but I won't talk about that too much. So I've got a USB connector. So I'm actually connecting those Wi-Fi adapters inside the Faraday cage to outside the Faraday cage via USB, and I can connect that to my laptop, and I see the 2 adapters on my laptop. And, lo and behold, if I start running, some access point software, I can actually only see my access point. The power is negative 29 up there, it says, which is quite strong, and it's pretty good. So I'm not detecting any other SSIDs out there. So my system seems to work. And from inside, from outside that Faraday box, I've got software running an access point, and I'm able to see that Wi-Fi effectively. The next step that I sort of need to do is I need to run Linux inside a kernel debugger on the receiver side, and on the AP side, the access point side, the transmitter sides, using transmitter and receiver loosely here, want to patch the kernel to mutate or fuzz that soft Mac implementation. So the firmware implementation in the Linux kernel that can do some of the Wi-Fi processing, start mutating some of the transmissions that are going across, and see if I can get some kernel crashes on the receiving side, and then start fuzzing a bunch of Wi-Fi chipsets as well. It's sort of not that interesting, I suppose. Wi-Fi, I haven't really done too much with it besides, set up a little environment. But what I have done a lot more with is attacking baseband. And this is looking at cellular communication. And not everyone is aware that your mobile phone has an application processor. Everyone knows that's pretty much it. It has an application processor that runs your OS and your software and your applications and so forth. But typically with every mobile phone, there's also another processor called a baseband processor. And the baseband processor, sometimes it's a core inside a CPU. Sometimes it's a separate chip as well. But the baseband processor handles the radio communication. And the reason that this is separate to the application processor is that your cellular communications needs to be real time. It needs to be very fast and prompt. Whereas your application processor doesn't need to be real time. It can run, Linux, or it can run iOS, or whatever it might be. But your baseband processor needs to be real time because it's handling radio communication and processing that cellular communication with the base stations and cellular towers and cell towers that it's working with. So there's actually not a lot of research, there's only a little bit of research actually, but there's been a few attacks against baseband processors who run their own firmware, they run their own real-time operating system and do that cellular communication processing and the DSP associated with that. And you can exploit that, and you can actually get code execution on a baseband processor and do things with it. Sometimes you can escalate to the application processor, or sometimes you can just stay in the baseband processor and start eavesdropping on cell calls and do various other things. So in this particular case, I've got an Android phone sitting inside my Ramsey box, connected via USB to the outside of the Ramsey box. It's an Android device that I've got in this particular setup. I've enabled USB debugging on the mobile phone as well. And I need to do this so that I can actually manage the phone via my laptop from outside the box. So in this particular picture that I've got here, on the left is my mobile phone screen. It's just a mirror of what's actually on my mobile phone. And I can do everything that I can do with my normal mobile phone and additional stuff such as getting login information, getting a shell on the device, and a bunch of other things too. So I'm managing my mobile phone in real time from outside that Ramsey box via that USB pass-through connector. What I've also done is I've connected a software-defined radio via that SMA pass-through to inside the Ramsey box. And I connected that to a USRP B210, which is a software-defined radio. It's a pretty pricey one. It's sort of a mid range one. It's about $2,000 Australian. And it can do the types of things that I want to do with running my own base station. Now, for the software that I've got some open source software that I'm using running on my laptop in Linux. It's called SRS LTE, and it's an open source 4G base station implementation. And for those that work with cellular, it implements a very slimmed down version of an EPC and an ENB. And in this particular case here, I'm running my base station software, and from outside the laptop, I can see what's happening on my phone. And when I scan for networks, I can actually see a new network pop up called 00101, and that's our fake base station, which will soon become a malicious base station. So we've built a 4G base station that the phone can see, and only inside the Ramsey box is this network present, and I can manage my phone from outside the box. So as part of a sort of a standard base station, and this works on a number of generations, to be honest, there's this broadcast traffic, and the broadcast traffic is part of things called system information blocks, or SIBs, and it tells mobile handsets a bunch of information, including I'm a base station, I'm here, this is my information about what I'm doing. So that 00101 in the last slide, this is the broadcast traffic that base stations continuously send and mobile handsets receive pre-authentication. So they have to do this pre-authentication because they have to identify what networks are available before they can authenticate to the network. So in this particular case, I've decided that at a random sort of interval, I'm just going to mutate a byte that gets sent out over the air. That's part of this pre-auth broadcast traffic, and I'm going to fuzz it. And hopefully, if I can get my baseband processor on my mobile phone to crash. And so when I actually do baseband fuzzing, it's pretty cool. And this is, I haven't sort of set this up specifically. This is just random fuzzing of all the SIBs that are being sent out, which include the available networks and the network name that it's sort of sending out. So in this particular case, I've just taken sort of, a photo of on my phone via this remote management tool. And it shows that the available network, it's just randomly mutated the byte that is associated with, the country code and the network ID as well. So we can see on the left, it's 51081 is the available network, and on the right, 50520. So it's apparent that this fuzzing of SIBs is working, and hopefully we'll get a crash out of our baseband processor from some malformed frame or packet that gets sent and processed that's being transmitted by our malicious base station. But that's where I'm up to. So the next steps, outside of fuzzing pre-auth communication, you can fuzz authenticated, network authenticated stuff as well. And that allows us sort of a bigger attack surface that you can access. But to do that, you need to write your own SIM cards, which is quite achievable. You can buy the stuff online to do that, fairly cheaply. And you need to do that because as part of 3G and onwards, there's mutual authentication between the mobile handset and the telco network via the SIM card key information that's in it. I'd also like to get better debug access to the baseband processor so that if I do get a crash, I can, have better access to see what it's doing and be able to sort of develop some exploitation around that. So that's it. That's sort of the things that you can do with the Faraday Cage. And there's more things you can do with the Faraday Cage, but these are two things that I've done with, and I've done the baseband attack quite a bit. So the heap, it's expensive, $8,000 for a Ramsey box and a couple of grand for an SDR, but it's heaps of fun if you have access to one and, like always, pwn all the things and have fun. So thank you very much. And I'll be on the Slack for a little bit tonight. So please give me some jokes and troll me a little bit. So thank you very much.